happy Friday to everybody. Looking forward to the weekend. Okay, so we're going to go with the lesson, and then we will open the floor up for comments. This is chapter 4 of our book that we're reviewing, and this is called Not an Ugly American, Saltas, Saltas, a Dutch reporter as an agent of the West in Africa. So we start off with a quote that says, "We are no advocates of xenophobia, nor are we fanatics. We are anti-feudal. We are anti-neutralist. We are with the West." This was a statement from the first president of Tanzania in 1957. It was loud and clear that the readers of the American Journal of News and Opinion, called the New Leader, TNL, the New Leader, could be confident that an independent Tunisia would not ally with Stalin. The words were spoken during an increased tension between Tanzania nationalists and the French authorities, in which the US government was urged to intervene by putting pressure on the French. Because again, if you guys remember, most of the research that we did when these former, and I'm going to put that in air quotes, African colonies were quote unquote granted their freedom, the colonialists not only didn't want to leave, if they actually did leave in any significant manner, they remained in the military, and they remained in control of their former colonies through a network of NGOs and the World Bank and the IMF and the World Wildlife Fund. There was all kinds of entities, to include intelligence, that descended upon the quote-unquote former colony to keep the former colony under the control of the West. So the core of the article that was written was a unique interview with the newly anointed person in charge. And I'm not exactly sure how you say this name, but the last name is Bourguiba. Bourguiba. His first name is Habib, Habib, who was exiled by the French to a bleak hotel in a Tanzania mountain village. The interview and article was the work of Saltas, the new leader expert on North African affairs during the 1950s. In other words, he was the anointed person that was going to produce all of the media. In particular, the struggles for independence of Morocco, Tanzania, and Algeria. It is no coincidence that TAS focused on a pro-Western view of not just Bourguiba in this article of the new leader, and he was considered to be the reporter was considered to be very biased. So in the article, he, let's see, it was one of the American's periodicals with an outspoken anti-communist liberal perspective on everything to do with politics and culture. Commentary, Partisan Review, and Politics was the name of one of the articles. In the American political process, in particular foreign policy, the new leader served as a trustworthy source, source of information and opinion for members of Congress and the political elite. The magazine had been founded as an official mouthpiece of the American Socialist Party in 1924. Due to its dedication of the executive editor, Samuel Sol, S-O-L, Levitas, Levitas. Its profile evolved into a combination of progressive social advocacy and staunch Cold War combativeness. After the Second World War, it became even more popular. This attracted a global readership as well as the U.S. administration's attention. The State Department and the CIA considered the new leader a useful ally in their Cold War propaganda. They supported the journal financially. Levitas also succeeded in connecting figures such as Hannah Arendt, Arendt, author Arthur Koestler, Coestler, Daniel Bell, and Sidney Hook to the journal. Its correspondence of French affairs in the early 1950s was a Dutch reporter, Saul Tas, T-A-S. In his The New Leader contributions on North Africa, Tas continually appealed to the U.S. government to put pressure on the French to end colonial rule. If the U.S. kept silent, America's prestige in the Third World would be severely harmed. The consequence would be pushing them into the arms of the communists. At least that's what he believed. In emphasizing the anti-communist stance of nationalist movements, Tas tried to reassure his American audience. Later in the 50s and 60s, Tas expanded his area of operation to sub-Saharan Africa. Starting in 63, he was infiltrated with the Center of Labor and Social Studies Incorporated in Rome, Italy, which focused on training and assisting underdeveloped countries on their road to development. These activities made Tas an energetic agent for the West. Operating in an intensively transnational state-private network of diplomats, administrators, labor officials, intellectuals, and journalists who were engaged in a cultural Cold War. He belonged to a group of international journalists and correspondents who informed Irving Brown, director of the union that we've been talking about, the European Office of the American Federation of Labor, AFL, and one of the key figures of the International Confederation of Free Labor Unions on non-West parts of the world. Both the AFL and the ICFTU, that international version of it, aimed at challenging communism and beating it at its own game, said Brown. The journalist network included Helmi Sabor, Sabbour, in the Near East, Leon Denon, reporting on Eastern Europe, Robert Alexander, and Serafino Romaldi, Romualdi, on Latin America. And then they moved into North Africa. Together with Saul Tas, one of the guys, Farhat, Farhat, Hached, Hached, was murdered on 5 December 1952. And this left Saul Tas as the main informant in many of these locations. The informant's reports were for AFL eyes only, but most of them had been published and their opinions appeared in the New Leader or European publications like The Encounter or a magazine called Preubes. None of them were Americans, and they were all dedicated to anti-communism. They acquired access to people and organizations in foreign countries that the Americans couldn't access or didn't, and therefore became very useful. They enriched the perceptions of their American principles and readers with their non-American perspectives. It was essential for their role as agents of the West, and Saul Toss exemplified this identity. Toss had been a determined anti-communist all his professional life. Following the Second World War, he was one of the hardliners in the Dutch Labor Party. Disappointed with the dogmatic Dutch Social Democrat Party, he soon developed an outspoken, radical socialist political opinion, challenging communists as well as social democrats for lacking a fighting spirit, which was needed to battle not just communism, but capitalism as well. He also had taken on economics. Later in the 1930s, Toss turned hostile to the unquestioned socialist admiration of the masses. He stopped believing in Marxist dialectics and pointed to the overwhelming support of the German proletariat for Hitler. Marx had been wrong in his prediction that the proletarian masses would be the vanguard of the socialist society. Instead, Toss proposed a new socialist movement led by the nucleus of educated leaders who could prepare the road to socialism in a more rational way. Toss was Jewish and had to go into hiding during the German occupation of the Netherlands. In this period, he kept reading and writing, focusing on post-war Europe, warning against Stalin, who wasn't to be trusted even as an ally. Now, you have to find that totally crazy, that he's basically advocating for all of the same policies as Hitler while he's in hiding from Hitler and denouncing Stalin, who was trying to eradicate the Nazis. In 1945, he reconciled himself with the Social Democrats, hoping for a new post-war Labor Party that would oppose totalitarianism and fight for a just society. Toss was hired as a foreign desk reporter by the Socialist Democrat newspaper called Hot Parole, which had its origins in the wartime resistance movement. They were craving for a press in which freedom of information and opinion ruled. He soon became one of the star reporters of the paper. He warned his readers against further expansion of Soviet communism and called for a greater alertness among the Western states. The 1948 coup in Prague reaffirmed his suspicions and his worst fears. Even more after he visited Prague, right after the coup, he was deeply shocked on seeing the realities of communism, which he compared the communist police force to the German Nazis. Prague in 1948 became a radicalizing turning point in his reporting. Todd's dedication to fighting communism was equaled by his anti-colonialism. He was a student during colonial law and administration, aiming at a future as a colonial administrator in the Dutch West Indies. So he's anti-colonialism, while earlier he was trying to be one of them. Hearing the experiences of colonial rule opened Toss's eyes to the injustice. One of them, a guy by the name of Sahrir, Sjahrir, became a close friend. He became one of the prominent leaders in Indonesia's nationalist movement after he returned to the Dutch East Indies. Toss' involvement with him and other nationalists made him a lifelong supporter and propagandist of independence for colonial territories, particularly the Dutch East Indies. He wrote blazing articles of protest against the inhuman treatment of Indonesian population by the Dutch. In 1945, Sukarno proclaimed the Republic of Indonesia independent. A coalition of social democratic and Catholic parties reacted with suppressing the rebellion through force. The Labour Party supported two military actions in Indonesia to restore the Dutch rule. Only after severe American pressure were the Dutch willing to restart negotiations. And in 1949, Queen Juliana signed the transfer of sovereignty and made Indonesia independent. The predominance of Dutch national self-interest in the Indonesian conflict, and in particular the Labour Party's position, made him decide that the Dutch political climate of opinion had become too parochial. As the Paris correspondent, Toss had ample opportunities to report on European affairs, NATO politics, French politics, and other foreign affairs. In the tense Cold War climate of the 50s, his opinions usually fit very well with a radical anti-communist pro-Western profile. New chances arose when Saul Levitas was looking for a TNL correspondent in Paris. Already in 1948, Toss had offered Levitas a contribution on Czechoslovakia, but Levitas had declined, instead suggesting that Toss write from time to time on important events in Holland that would be of interest to American readers. Toss was also had also recommended to Levitas was recommended to Levitas, by Sidney Hook. There was an interview in the summer of 1948. Politically, the three of them were basically all in the same pot. Toss' arrival in Paris coincided with the increasing activities of nationalist parties in Morocco and Tanzania. For Toss, it was rather easy to get access to North Africa's independent movement because he began tapping into the African students in Paris. Toss could easily relate to these fighters for freedom and win their trust. His anti-colonialism and references to his friendship was helpful with his friendship with the Indonesians. One of the students was a Tanzanian, Mosmati was his name. He later became Tunisia's first Secretary of State. Mosmati was Toss's introduction to Bourguiba, the leader of the Nationalist Party, and later the first president of the independent Tunisia. These connections gave him the opportunity to extend his network to other nationalist leaders in Morocco and Algeria. Contacts like these made him highly sought after by the U.S. Embassy in Paris and the European office of the Union, AFL. The embassy employees were hardly able to connect to North Africans nationalists because the U.S. administration strongly supported the French. The AFL's policy was to limit communist influence in North African trade unions. However, the organization had become somewhat suspect itself because Irving Brown's connections with the CIA, giving him a reputation as a notorious money man for the CIA around the world. Toss was able to move around relatively easy in all of these areas. So he began achieving quite a sense of power, and TNL offered him the opportunity to integrate into many of those networks in North Africa. His records contain correspondence with people like Walter Robinson, Assistant Secretary of State, the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, Adlai Stevenson, Democratic politician and 1952 presidential candidate Michael Harris of the Ford Foundation, CIA front, Paul Hayes of the School of Law in Columbia University, several high position officers in the State Department. While Harris and Hayes belonged to his personal friends list, he also established a relationship with writer James Farrell, Farrell. Most of Ta's African contributions to T&L dealt with the long, troublesome process of decolonialization of French North African colonies. Often, he introduced the need for independence by focusing on inequality between the native population in French. Quote, a glance at the countryside tells the whole story. On one side of the road, you see a huge estate with an up-to-date machinery, and in the middle, a beautiful villa with a garage. On the other side, you see a patch of land poorly tilled with ox-drawn plows, with a small, squalid hut to shelter the Arab owner and his entire, usually large family, unquote. Appealing to his liberal audience in America, he pointed out how an American airfield construction company was forced to employ two wage scales for its laborers, a high one for the French and a low one for the Moroccans. In an analysis, the Moroccan political situation, Tass paid much attention to the nationalist movement inside of all of these countries. He emphasized that none of these nationalist movements were communist. One of them even had worked with Coca-Cola when the French wine growers started their campaign against the introduction of soft drinks in Morocco. And he made it crystal clear while it was time for the US to change its policy towards France, quote, a free world cannot be committed to a reactionary policy in Africa despite French threats, unquote. Cleverly, he also emphasized America's moral responsibility in focusing on the injustice and inequality of French colonial rule. The cause of actions in Tanzania was very similar to Morocco. The moderate nationalist movement was firmly supported by trade unions, middle classes, farmers, and drew increasingly opposed to repressive measures from the French. Tass's 1952 interview with the leader in exile, Bourguiba, drew a lot of attention. In this article, he made the message very explicit. Quote, continued repression can only foster rancor and extremism. That is to say, communism. In Tanzania, we can win an Arab ally able and willing to become an enthusiastic partner of the West in the common struggle against threatened Soviet aggression, unquote. 8 months later, the Tanzania situation grew worse. Again, Tass made it very clear that the U.S. should think twice before supporting France. Quote, we are faced with a mortal enemy who feeds on unrest, especially where such unrest is based on poverty and cultural backwardsness, unquote. In March of 54, Bourguiba was released. AFL funding enabled him to travel to New York, where he addressed the UN General Assembly. Tass promised his readers, quote, if we in the West provide the necessity and the support, Tanzania seems destined to become a stronghold of democracy in North Africa, unquote. In Algeria, the path to independence took much longer and even was more complicated and violent. The FLN had started a war of independence in 54 that lasted until 62, which we've covered quite extensively. Tass said, quote, on both sides, there's stubborn, poisonous will to exterminate the enemy. An atmosphere of murder pervades the whole scene and rolls like a fog over the battlefield. cloaking all maneuvers, preventing true insight, unquote. He also wrote an article called A Way Out of Algeria, that NATO should interfere directly. These suggestions were adopted by a growing number of American congressmen like John F. Kennedy, William Fulbright, and Hubert Humphrey. In July of 1957, Humphrey addressed the Senate. Mr. President, the Senate's attention has recently been directed to the disintegrating situation in Algeria. Among the proposals of constructive resolution of this explosive problem is the suggestion that NATO be involved. Humphrey urgently advised his fellow senators to read Toss's article and entered it into the congressional record. Congressional criticism didn't have much effect on the Eisenhower administration. For Toss, Humphrey's speech was further recognition of his importance in the North African affair. Later in 57, he composed a long report on the Algerian situation, and that report was done at the request of the AFL. Two Algerian independent movements, the proletarian nationalist movement, called MNA, and also one that was deemed more extremist, the FLN. Toss warned that the FLN people only think in black and white. They do not think as politicians. The current deadlock could only be broken by negotiations. The election of Charles de Gaulle as the first president of the Fifth French Republic in 59 reassured Toss that a solution for Algeria was close. De Gaulle was a realist in foreign policy. He offered the stability that France needed. De Gaulle knew that France would turn into an isolated country if it continued to refuse Algeria its autonomy. As Toss recognized, de Gaulle wants to have his hands free of a diplomatic failure, and success can only be attained with the assent of his most important allies. Although he could not foresee a French-American conflict on NATO leadership that were to come. As Toss predicted, de Gaulle did act to end the Algerian tragedy, granting Algeria independence in 1962. Humphrey's 1957 speech shows, as well as the regular compliments Saul Lavidas passed on to him, quote, "By the way, I want you to know this interview created quite a stir, and I received many requests for permission to reprint it," Lavas informed Toss after his interview with the Algerian nationalist leader Mzali Hadj, which had been published in early 1959. Toss seemed to have been the right guide for liberal America through all of this. During the 1950s and 60s, Toss made several trips to sub-Saharan Africa. In 1953, he visited South Africa for the first time. That followed several trips to French West Africa and later to the Central African states as well. Toss was fascinated by Africa, its jungles, the wilderness, the primitive lifestyles. However, this primitiveness also required a special responsibility of the West to educate and guide African nations into modern life and civilization. With the rapid independence of former European colonies, Africa had turned into a new battleground for the Cold War. In Toss's perception, only economic development and creation of democratic political elite could prevent an increase in communist influence. And I'm just going to point out this democratic political elite is where it all went bad, because this is the exact same colonialism, just cloaked as a different method. So this is exactly what they had been doing forever. Remember when we talked about Cuba and how when they went in, the people like William Pauly and bought up all of the industry, they groomed a political elite that allowed them to be the plantation overseers and oppress all of the rest of the people there. They did it throughout Latin America. Not a good way of doing it. In 1963, TOS became affiliated with a rather obscure American organization located in Rome. This organization was called the Center for Labor and Social Studies, CLSS. The Center for Labor and Social Studies paid him for reports on political developments in all the new independent African states. They hired him to participate in seminars on democratic leadership for potential future African leaders. Very little is known about the CLSS, and there are no accessible records left, and references to its existence have basically been scrubbed. It originated in a committee established in 1956 by TNL editor Sol Levitas, which had mainly engaged in supporting labor unionists who were being prosecuted by totalitarian regimes. After Levitas' death in 1961, the committee basically was ineffective. Around the same time, the CIA expanded into new fields of front operations. Evidence suggests that the agency appropriated the committee and transformed the CLSS in 1962. A case officer by the name of Edward Whittemore, Whittemore, became its director. At first, CLSS focused mainly on Africa, but in 1965, they opened new office in Kuala Lumpur and Tokyo. The center was supported by internationalist, socialist, and trade unions. It presented itself as privately funded, but it was CIA funded. Social justice, let me say that again. Social justice was at its core. Its creed was service, research, solidarity, and its activities were described as follows. Quote, the center encourages and assists in the publication of pertinent text in the field of interest. It carries out technical assistant programs and educational programs in administration, publications, and information techniques and related fields, unquote. In other words, it's propaganda. The initial focus on African labor unions and leaders was a deliberate choice. In colonial times, non-white unions were the vanguard of the nationalist independent movement. In particular, in Africa, the unions were often the training grounds and starting points for a political career. In offering union officials training and educational programs, the CLSS might counter the substantial, covert, quote unquote, Soviet penetration of African labor movements. And you guys see the same thing building. They are using the boogeyman of the Soviet Union to build their own infiltrated labor. In 1965, Whittemore became the director of the Tokyo office. He was replaced in Rome by a guy by the name of Charles McCary, McCarry, who was also a CIA asset. McCary had been working for the agency since 1957, performing undercover assignments all over the world. He resigned from CLSS and from the CIA in July of 1967 because he wished to return to the U.S. after 10 years of being abroad and to his profession as a writer of quote-unquote spy novels. It seems likely that his resignation also had everything to do with the exposure of the CIA as the secret funder of civic organizations both inside and outside the U.S. Considering the positions of Whittemore and McCary, the CLSS was nothing more than a CIA front. The CLSS activities seem to have been rather low-key. According to its annual report in 64 and 65, they compiled a directory of some 300 European, quote unquote, non-governmental organizations in which they were setting up, training, and providing technical assistance to. Let me say that number again, 300. They also published a document, a review on a periodic basis called The Analyst, which aimed at the audience of trade unionists and intellectual leaders. It also distributed a weekly newsletter called Afrograms, Afrogrammes. They published that in both French and English. The center offered assistance to study tours of research scholars and published brochures on current events. Now, again, study tours and research scholars are CIA. In late 1963, it started a project in direct assistance with the main Free Trade Union Federation in the Congo. 1963, which is in the immediate aftermath of having killed Lumumba and put their own stooge in charge. The project consisted of an information program and training program for public relations. A similar project was started in Nigeria, where the United Labor Congress was the principal pro-Western labor federation. The CLSS financed the National Journal of the ULC, while the League for International and Social Cooperative Development of Denver, Colorado, which was a major recipient of CIA funds, paid thousands of dollars annually to a school that offered seminars and training programs, one of which was called the Organizational Procedures and Democratic Process. Quote, the course includes practical training in the techniques of leadership together with an examination of democratic processes, unquote. None of which was ever used by the CIA because they have absolutely no use for democratic processes. Toss had stopped writing for the TNL in 1962 because he didn't agree with the post-Levitas editorial policy. At the same time, his relationship with the editor of Hit Parole had deteriorated because of the limitations of his budget and travel opportunities. Instead, his attention was drawn to CLSS as well. In June 1963, he contacted Edward Whitmore, asking if he could make a trip to Cuba later that year under the auspices of researching what was going on in Cuba. This request resulted in fruitful cooperation over several years, allowing Toss to break his contract with Het Parool allowed him to keep writing. Performing assignments for CLSS offered him an ample way to propagate Western interest in underdeveloped countries. If he knew of the CIA connections, it obviously didn't bother him. But everybody knew back then that it was a CIA front. So he continued to write and do spying for him. His visit to Ethiopia in 1964 offered a representative impression of the activities going on there. He lectured at a university, and the topic was Africa and socialism. Also, since the intelligentsia of the underdeveloped people themselves are impatient, he told them that they would be tempted by violence to achieve shortcuts to democracy. Toss warned, quote, violent, dictatorial, unscrupulous methods lead to destruction of the personality, especially when the methods are applied on a mass scale. But the human element of your most important, if not your only capital. Destruction of the personality, therefore, means destruction of the human capital of your national capital, unquote. In other words, do what you're told. The intelligentsia, he also wrote this, the intelligentsia are powerless, embittered, and restless. The overwhelming majority of the intellectuals is anti-communist labor socialists. They are willing to assist the emperor in the modernization of the nations, but they want to be handled as adults. Toss had advised his audience to establish a kind of Fabian society in order to become an influential force in Ethiopian politics. He also suggested that they set up an Ethiopian branch of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which is the CIA. Quote, the emperor would think twice before attacking a group that has sympathy, respect, and organizational support of the democratic labor world, which eventually can mobilize world labor opinion, unquote. Toss even mediated between some of the Ethiopians and the CCF headquarters in Paris. Toss also contributed to The Analyst using the pseudonym Ephraim Roget, Roget. In Zanzibar, after the Long Knives, he sketched how the Russians, Chinese, and East Germans had tried to turn Zanzibar into a center of communist propaganda for East Africa after its independence in December 1963. Zanzibar was thus becoming a testing ground for communism in Africa. That's what he wrote. The union with Tanganyika was a victory for Africans over communists of the modern revolutionaries in Zanzibar. Toss's relationship with CLSS ended in September 1967 when the organization was dissolved. So that basically gets us to the end. There's a summary, but obviously, kind of the only point that I would make in closing this chapter is the fact that you have so many different facets of the CIA branching out, all collectively working with each other. What I liked about this book is we have not spent very much time in the last 2 years kind of investigating the infiltration into the union efforts. And it was extensive. And I think the essay authors in this book does a great examination of how they were infiltrated. They, like many of the cultural, much of the media, and economically, we've kind of looked at all of them, the different companies involved, the paramilitary that's involved. And what I found interesting when I first and researched into the National Endowment for Democracy, you have the U.S. Chamber. Remember, there's 4 pots of money, one for Republicans, one for Democrats, which basically took the political piece of this. The Chamber of Commerce, which took the one aspect of the economical being big business, and then the other was the labor pot. That's the 4 pots. And big business has to control labor. And so those two things worked economically. And then, of course, Operation Gladio was the paramilitary piece of this. And collectively, they all worked together in order to control literally everything. And so we've looked a lot at many of the different big businesses like W.R. Grace and IBM and PepsiCo and ITT and all of these different corporations that the chamber pot of slush fund money kind of facilitated. The piece that I had not looked at, and then, of course, more recently, when we started talking about the National Endowment for Democracy a lot, I began researching all of the different labor aspects of this cohesive approach to recolonialize under a different mask these different previously colonialized countries. And I found it fascinating that there is so much information out there about the union's involvement all over the world. I had no idea there was so much of it. But this book, as I said, instead of doing individual articles, these guys take for every essay, there's probably no less than, well, in this one, there's 37 references. Let me just, I also highlighted two that I wanted to mention. Whittemore's CIA connections is acknowledged in Anne Sydenham, Sydemham's, I don't know if it's an article or a book, must be an article, called Dreaming of Jerusalem, the title, The New York Review of Science Fiction, and there's an online reference to it. I'll post it later. The other note of importance is, and I'm going to quote it, its executive board consisted of, talking about the CLSS, of David Dubinsky, Dubinsky, who was president of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, Serafino Romaldi, who was executive director of the American Institute for Free Labor Development, L.L. Bora, who was general secretary of the United Labor Congress of Nigeria, Hans Oprecht, former president of the Swiss Socialist Party, Italo Veglianzi, founder and first secretary of an Italian labor union, UIL, Bruno Storti, who was the Christian Democrat politician, Secretary General of the, Labor Confederation of Italy, Niels Matheson, who was Secretary General of the Danish Social Democrat Party, and Ben Josephson, who was director, and I'm going to spell this, TAMIMENT Foundation. So those were the two, and I only mention those because they talk about all of the different names from all of the different countries that were all involved with a CIA front that basically was acting on NATO's behalf to do the same thing that the paramilitary units do. Okay, so we can open it up at that point.
Can I jump in for just a second?
Yeah.
That Whitmore was Operation Mockingbird before Operation Mockingbird. He absolutely, I mean, it is from the, okay, let me slow down. They used his history of being a CIA agent to endorse and give credit to his books, which were nothing more than selling propaganda.
Correct.
And they weren't even well-written propaganda. It truly is just mind-blowing sometimes.
Correct. It's mind-blowing all the time, as far as I'm concerned.
Right, right.
All right. Stellar, is that you? I can't hear you.
And Kim requested a mic.
Kim, did you have something that you wanted to say?
Hi, I'm Kim. It got real choppy. She's back. I can introduce myself. Sorry, I'm Kim. Hi. I wanted to know what does the company name ICF stand for?
ICF?
There was some stuff pinned down in the discussions that have been affiliated with this discussion where it's the company ICF. I wondered if there was affiliation with the International Coaching Federation because I come from Global Human Capital and I thought, oh, that'd be bad.
Well, ICF, I believe, is actually ICFTU, which is the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions, because we were talking about the CIA's infiltration of the unions, both in the United States and around the world.
Yeah. Gotcha. Okay. That's all I wanted is clarity on that. And I was reading around trying to figure it out. And I thought I'd say hi. This has been an enjoyable read and listen at the same time. Thank you for doing the space.
Sure. Sunshine? Oh, Stellar's back. What'd you have, Stellar?
I was just going to say, I hope that everyone retweets and reshares this or reposts this space and all these recordings. Invite your friends and family. Because seriously, these shenanigans that they were doing that you're talking about historically, they're still in play today. And that is what is so freaking mind-boggling. And then that's all I wanted to say. So please, everybody, please share, because this is literally like true history, not this BS stuff. I was watching Joe Rogan at my friend's house yesterday, and they had this dude, and I kid you not, like we have the CIA spoofs within, influencers, within television, because of, it's all part of this whole thing is all Operation Gladio. This guy was on there yesterday, and he was talking as if, he got upset with the American guy who's part Jewish, who is also or Jewish religion, American veteran and stuff like that, also a comedian. And when he was propping up this British dude, propping up Winston Churchill, the American guy was like, why would you talk about that? And then he's like, you guys shouldn't be talking to them. You should be listening to these people that have educations and stuff. I'm like, holy crap. When you say they're doing this all over the freaking world, they are doing this all over the freaking world. And I just saw an MI6 guy who is a spook who's talking on behalf of all the globalists that are in. Oh my gosh. And it just makes me so angry. Sorry.
So obviously watching those types of shows, now that we all understand what's going on. So let me just kind of paraphrase this, since we have new people in the audience every day. I want everyone to understand that unions have never represented workers, ever. Have there been people in the union sphere that really wanted to represent workers? Yes. But the actual unions and their affiliation with the mafia and their affiliation with the intelligence world all work collectively together. If you get too far off the reservation of caring too much about the workers and not enough about the companies that you supposedly are in battle against, they'll just take you out. We have multiple examples of that. So if you go back, more than 100 years ago, during the quote unquote monopoly, where they had the big Supreme Court, we're not going to have monopolies, we're going to break them all up like Standard Oil. That again was all bullshit. They didn't break up monopolies. All Standard Oil did was create a bunch of different companies that all basically did exactly the same thing. They shared board members, they shared stock. It was all a hologram of not having a monopoly. The unions have basically operated very much the same way. That's the reason why you have all of these mafia people associated with managing the pension funds of unions. It was a collective way to have resources that they could quote unquote invest, which means money launder. And then they turned out to be bad investments and they basically just stole all your money. So Teamsters was notorious for doing this. So was many others. And it also gave them, because of the longshoremen, control of all of our ports, all of the trucking. So they have the ability. And so you go back to, okay, we're going to get rid of the monopolies. All they did was do a couple of different things. They immediately set up trade associations and labor unions. Trade associations are the ones that were consulted on all of the rules and regulations that were going to, quote unquote, hold big business accountable. Well, they put big business people in the trade associations, and it did absolutely nothing. The same thing with the unions. So now you've got another hologram in effect that everybody goes, oh, thank God that we don't have monopolies anymore, which you still had. And oh, thank God we have unions because they're going to take care of the people, which they did not. And so not only did the unions here in America give you the illusion that they were taking care of the workers, while at the same time, not a single fucking union said a word about all of their jobs going overseas, by the way. And all of that was facilitated by big business. So if you go overseas, the fact that you heard, if you were paying attention in the 50s and 60s, as all of these coups were happening and into the 70s and 80s, all over Latin America, all over Africa, you heard about this communist infiltration of these countries. When in fact, what was happening is nationalist people who actually cared about their own citizens were forming political parties and union efforts to make more than 87 cents a day in copper mines in Chile, or picking bananas for United Fruit, an American company that had bought up all the farmland in Guatemala, Cuba, blah, 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 Nicaragua. So the very country that now has this problem with a foreign country owning their farmland had oligarchs who went around the world buying up all of their farmland. And then when the unions, legitimate actual unions, tried to form in these foreign countries, the CIA was tasked by the oligarchs to go down and break them up. And what I just read to you was one of the efforts to do that in the Northern African countries. They infiltrated any legitimate effort to unionize to protect their own workers, while at the same time calling any legitimate union effort communist, so that they could create fake unions under the guise of AFL, eventually CIO. And they trained unionists to go into these countries to, quote unquote, infiltrate and then manage fake unions. And that way they could then broadcast to the world that all of these dictators had set up unions, like in Chile and Nicaragua, where the CIA had installed, no kidding, dictators that killed tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people. Then they got to brag about how the fact that they set up unions, which were fake unions, not the real unions that they got rid of. So that's basically what I just read to you. Sunshine, go ahead.
Holy cow. When you hit on that union stuff, I'm like, okay, coming from Detroit, Motor City, holy cow. I've watched it all play out. The whole union thing, the jobs going overseas, the union's not doing, oh my God. You hit on everything. And it wasn't even my question. But after Stellar said that, I was just like, whew, yeah, that hit home really, really, really hit home. And everybody knows where Hoffa is buried too in Detroit.
And Sunshine, just like Vegas, the mob was here, remember? And that's all the laundering. And now what do we have? All the corporations that are all unionized.
Yeah. I mean, and these unions, they don't do anything for everybody up there, but, you know, their dues keep going up. They keep paying it. Ford, Chrysler, GM, you know, they all continue, but they're not helping them, that's for sure. And their jobs keep leaving the country. But Colonel, I actually wanted you to clarify on that name. Was it Whitmore or Whitmer?
Whittemore.
Whittemore. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'm just like, with all this nepotism, my mind was going to Gretchen Whitmer, and I'm like, wait a minute. You know, because we always find these names, you know.
Yeah, that's why I try to
so.
spell them all. It's Whittemore.
Okay. And I just saw Whitmer in Trump's office the other day when he was signing. She didn't look too happy.
Yeah. So I want to give a shout out to Fergie62 for donating over on Rumble $10. And a shout out. She says the Operation Gladio being revealed by the Colonel is completing the picture for so many of us. We have to make sure we never allow this stuff to go unchecked again. Where we go one, we go all. Absolutely, Fergie. Thank you very much for that. Ron, go ahead.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting that you're talking about the unions. I have said for quite a while that the unions no longer exist and especially in the United States, the unions have been co-opted going back probably to the 60s and 70s, that they are no longer they're no longer in existence to protect the American worker. In fact, what they are is they're involved in exporting, doing everything they can to outprice American workers so that these corporations will go overseas where they've got like the cheap slave labor, and they're existing essentially to fund themselves. And so they do it under the guise of, hey, we're going to, you know, get you more benefits or we get you higher pay. But then all that higher pay goes right straight back into the unions, which then ultimately funnels right back into the Democrat Party, and maybe to a smaller degree to the Republican Party. But we both know the Republican and the Democrat Party are essentially, you know, it's two sides of the same coin. But you know, I'm not necessarily familiar with how it's operated overseas, but organized labor in the United States, I mean, shit, that's what the whole thing, it's what the whole communist Bolshevik thing was, is workers of the world unite. So it makes perfect sense. And to kind of pile up on that is, you know, from the communistic standpoint, you know, the communists really focused hardcore on the African American community, going back into the 30s and 40s. And if you look at, I mean, that was where the unions really focused. I think it was, I'm drawing a blank of the guy's name, but he was an ardent communist, and then he saw kind of what was going on, and he's like, whoa, he took a step back, and Channing something or other, or I'm drawing a blank on his name, but anyway, he writes about that, and then you know, look at the BLM movement, which is kind of it's like a 45-degree offshoot of that, but it's essentially the same thing, where they're using that to divide the country, you know, racially, down racial lines, to instigate, because in the United States they can't have class warfare, it's race warfare. So anyway, but unions, in my opinion, you're 100% right with this. The unions are the primary tool that are using to you know, further this large agenda. So anyway, I'm gonna shut up on my rant.
Well, they also use class warfare. I mean, that's what the whole tax the rich thing is. They use anything that they can, as far as trying to find fault lines to divide people, because obviously people divided are much easier to control. So that's kind of, but yeah.
Well, that's 1,000% exactly. I mean, it's divide and conquer, and the only thing that we have to look forward to on our side is that ultimately they eat themselves, because they divide and conquer, and pretty soon there's nothing left to divide, and now they're eating themselves. And I think you can see an element of that within the LGBTQ community, because at first it was just the L and the LBGT, and then it was LGB, and then it was LGBTQ, and then it was LGBTQ plus, and now if you're a conservative who's homosexual, it's like now you're no longer part of it, and so it's like, it's just the system eating itself, and that's ultimately what it does, and that's why these communist regimes fail worldwide. But anyway, I digress.
Okay, all along.
Hello. Yeah. So, relating to, would you believe it, the 1968 RFK campaign? I know I'm keep coming back to that, but to me, it's like a watermark of the Democratic Party, the history of the Democrats. And, you have basically what happens with the unions is they're like 50, 70 years. The leaders are all co-opted, and they're working, AFL style to suppress the CIO ingredient, and they're collaborating utterly with the Democrats, and everything is very suppressed for the rank and file of the unions. Okay, then, when push comes to shove, such as Vietnam, where you had the rank and files, kids coming back in boxes, there's going to be a flare up in it. And of course, Walter Reuther was not only about, the pushback from Vietnam of the rank and file, but also he was connected to the civil rights movement in an economic way, not just in a get to vote in elections that will be run by the rich from both sides way, but actually in an economic way. And then he's killed I understated his plane crashes, and I apologize, centrist that I am. He actually had 2 plane crashes, but there was a third incident in which there was a takeoff that was aborted with the altimeter, again, messed with on the runway. And so, this is where he was joining with MLK, RFK, and it's like the Democrats, they cannot have anyone ever pay attention to that, or everybody sees what they are right now. And also, I just wanted to say, related to the unions, I was in the humility known as the United Federation of Teachers, led by, these utterly co-opted DNC. They basically endorsed Hillary Clinton until the year 3636. And if she dies, they're not going to notice. Okay? So I saw personally, especially around 2015 here in New York, there was kind of a notorious meeting among the South Brooklyn teachers that was really gigantic. I'm talking about maybe 5,000 teachers were put in a gigantic auditorium, and we had, it was a moment where it was clearly like race alone and not race and class. And they pay for some speakers who basically they literally showed commercials they had made for Nike and Porsche, and we were supposed to be in awe of their historical consciousness or something, because they were successful in the sense of making a lot of money. And yet this is in no way helping quote unquote black people or quote unquote white people. It's helping some, as we know, it's helping the rich of across races. And by the way, in wealth distribution, the statistics are clear since that time that the wealth inequality is the same across races. It's identical, black, white, Hispanic, whatever. So it's just like, and one last thing I just wanted to comment. I mean, I think somebody said about, tax the rich. Maybe it was you, Colonel. A little bit of pushback there. I mean, I don't really think that the Democrats are using that tax the rich rhetoric at all seriously, because they're just not taxing the rich.
All along. I didn't mean that they take
Right.
it seriously. I'm pointing out that they use that as mantra to establish a fraction line in the poor versus rich. They will do anything. They will say anything. They don't mean any of it. It's all just bullshit. They don't, any tax that they come up with to quote unquote tax the rich, there's a loophole in it that doesn't apply to them, which is why they put all their money in foundations. They don't pay any taxes. The entire thing's bullshit. Yeah, they do that for rhetoric. They do that for propaganda. I agree with you completely. Miles, go ahead.
Hi, Colonel. I love the new technology. You can look at a subject or talk about something and pull it up right away. So here in Minnesota, I was kind of surprised that when I looked at the date of the United Steelworkers when they formed their union was in 1942, and then it migrated, of course, to Minnesota up in the Iron Range for the taconite mines. I know that there was a farmers union set up before that, but it kind of shows you how a region can kind of be completely taken over by the unions, where, you know, you can have your general population would be more conservative and to the right, but you've got a group of people that just kind of take over. So that's what's happening in Minnesota. It's been happening probably since the 40s.
Yeah,
Thanks.
and they don't just kind of take over. They are sent to training to take over. Yeah, it's all on purpose. Yeah, I agree completely. Anybody else got anything?
Can I digress just on one little
Sure.
piece of what to the gentleman that was speaking about, like the LGBTQ, thing with all of this? Please don't misconstrue like all those letters, because all that plus stuff is about getting to your children. Okay, I do a lot of work with the Project Milk Carton Foundation, and that's all propaganda to get to your children. Please know that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, I'm very well aware of that, and I wasn't trying to be insulting. I was just trying to
Oh, no, I wasn't trying to insult.
Yeah, I was just trying to use that as an example of how the left eats itself ultimately, because when they run out of people to divide, then they start to divide amongst themselves, and that was the kind of point that I was trying to make.
So let me throw you guys a curveball here. I found something very interesting, a couple of things actually, and I'm going to bring them to your attention because I want you guys to think about this kind of stuff with your Gladio glasses on. So you guys are very much aware that Kyle Seraphin has made himself, made an ass out of himself. And by trying to minimize a horrific organization 764, which I firmly believe is part of Operation Gladio to create terror. And it was hopefully noticeable to everybody in our audience that almost immediately there were three things that came out to discredit Kyle. One came from St. Louis field office, one came from a Virginia field office, and then Dan Bongino, as the deputy director of the FBI, made several comments about it being real, being horrific, telling everybody to pay attention to it, which totally discredited Kyle Seraphin. And of course, you're not going to get any contrite or apologetic gesture from him because he's way too arrogant for that to happen. But what I found most interesting is, I guess, night before last, who reached out to this downtrodden, completely discredited asset? Anybody?
I forwarded it to you, so wasn't it Alex Jones?
Yes, it was Alex Jones.
Yeah.
And what I find most fascinating about that is the accusation that many people have made about Alex Jones and him being somewhat associated in some form or fashion with intelligence. So if you want to save an asset, you'll use an asset. And let me just tell you, I know a lot of people like Alex Jones. I think there's a huge big question mark there. And one of the things that I noticed, again, with my Gladio glasses on, when Bridget Cousinett and I went through all of the testimony of Waco and all of the film footage of um, Alex Jones and all of the documents, and we found ties that were never exposed by any of them, ties the to Israel, ties to Israeli weapons, ties to the church in Southern California, which had implications to some of the Scientology, all of that stuff. So, what I want people to understand in psychological operations, you can use someone like an Alex Jones, and I am not accusing him. I want you guys to understand that. But I want you guys to recognize when you're being manipulated and propagandized. So if you're going to do a false flag, and I'm going to use Waco, but you will realize quickly as I talk through this that it applies to many others that he's been involved with. If you have someone that shows up immediately and all of the media is focused on him and he says all of these outrageous things and he perpetuates all of this emotional, everybody get up in arms kind of thing, what happens to the actual incident is it pales in comparison to the hoopla that is orchestrated around the incident. So don't pay attention to the details of the incident because you're going to quickly find out that it was a false flag. Pay attention to someone like an Alex Jones because he's going to draw the spotlight. And it just seems like in many of these instances, either him or someone like him is put front and center in order for all of the limelight to go there, and then they can critically analyze him and his good and bad points as opposed to focusing on the incident to be able to pick out all of the aspects of the false flag, not just the ones that he may mention to draw questions to it, but the real critical ones, like in the aftermath of knowing 100% at the time that the Fort Hood mechanized equipment was used, and pointing out that the commander was Wesley Clark, and all of the details of the identification of the weaponry that was there, and the involvement of the ATF, because had all of that stuff been identified at the time and people focused on that, you would have immediately saw the correlations to people involved in the Oklahoma bombing. That was going to be the next following year or so. It went back to Ruby Ridge. And so taking just one or two salacious aspects of one of those false flags and concentrating on that makes the rest of the stuff seem not noticeable. And I want people to understand that that's a thing. Now, let me give you one more example. You guys know that I went on News Treason Dave's show. I love him to death, by the way. He came over for a get together of patriots last weekend at my house. I got to actually personally meet him. He put up, and this is not, again, I'm not saying this critical of him in any way, shape, or form. So do not misunderstand what I'm saying. But I want to teach you a tactic he put up a video, which one of you guys sent me, that has a long excerpt of a video from Tori Says. Now, I've not talked about her in a very long time. I've not posted about her in a very long time. Brian Cates and I, at least 2.5 years ago, did a lot of digging into her background. There is absolutely nothing about her background that is true. She has like 10 aliases. She was found guilty by having left the state and not even defended herself in defrauding a charity for children. Her ex-husband had charges of being a pedophile. And there's so many things around her. She claims that she was Navy intelligence. She didn't even spend a year in the Navy. It did not give her enough time to even have finished an intelligence school and actually engaged in any intelligence work whatsoever. There's so many things about her background that is just delusional in what she does. And so Brian Cates came at it from a perspective that when him and Tracy Beans was doing Spygate and all that other stuff, Tori was basically just taking their information and pretending that it was hers. Well, over on True Social, when Bridget Cousinette and I started all of this, she was basically doing the same stuff with ours. And so I just reached out to Dave, and he was like, but it's a good video. And I said, it may be a good video, but here's what's going to happen. Number one, most of that information that she said she was involved in, she actually says in the video that she was responsible for overthrowing governments. Absolutely ridiculous. Also, when someone actually does a search on her, they're going to find out all of the information I just told you. So not only does it discredit her, but it discredits the topic. And that's the whole purpose of it. So this is a concerted effort, whether it's her by herself or she is actually working for some entity, because keep in mind, she is also the same person that submitted affidavits in the election fraud where Sidney Powell was trying to prove election fraud. And it was pointed out that both hers and one of her cohorts affidavits was fraudulent. So by her participating in that and submitting an affidavit that was fraudulent, it discredited the entire lawsuit, and it basically was thrown out, because then it looked like Sidney Powell didn't know what she was doing. So she is doing the exact same thing with our material. And so you have to be aware of the messenger, of people that talk on topics that are not credible, because the reason they talk on the topic is to co-opt the topic and therefore discredit the topic. So I just wanted to point those things out. Those are methods that are used, and we have to pay attention to them. Ron, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that, on the topic of Alex Jones, I think you're 100% right. I remember when I first red pilled back in like 2005 or 6, somebody told me, Jones, I'd met somebody who had been red pilled for a long time. And he says, yeah, Alex Jones, he's controlled opposition. And I was like, what are you talking about? No way. But I kind of followed Jones for a long time. My breaking point with Jones was when he went on Piers Morgan, and I want to say it was like 2014 timeframe, when he went on Alex Jones, or he went on Piers Morgan to talk about gun control. And at that moment in time, what we needed is somebody who was pro 2A. was to be somebody who was really kind of level-headed and methodical, and just talking about the things in a sane manner. But what he did was he came at it, and he was the stark raving lunatic that the left portrays us as on television. And what he did was, in my humble opinion, at that moment in time, he did more damage to the pro Second Amendment community at that moment. And to your point about him being the story, I had never really considered that as a point, but looking back at it in hindsight, I think you're 100% right. They make Alex Jones the story, so you don't go and you don't look at some of the details. So I thank you for pointing that out, but I want to confirm that I no longer really listen to Alex Jones. That doesn't mean that he doesn't put one or two good things out, or he doesn't put some good stuff out. But as somebody who has kind of graduated above what Alex Jones does, I think Alex Jones is much more of a disinformation operator than he is somebody who is productive within our movement. And with that, I'll let Sunshine go.
So, also, I don't know whether he's controlled op or not. I'm pointing out tactics to you guys. You guys can make your own opinion because we're all adults. His what I'm going to use the word rescuing Kyle from what obviously was a discrediting several days is very suspect to me. I'm going to say it that way. Also, keep in mind back 2 years ago, the first time I appeared on the pond with Operation Gladio. And it was the first time we had like 1,000 people there. First time eyes on for X, most of the information that Bridget Cousinet and I had found. And the next day, Jack Posebek discredits Operation Gladio, or basically gives it like 5 seconds. He then goes on the next day on to Alex Jones in another operation and does the exact same 5-second, yeah, it's this thing. It happened a long time ago. It's no big deal. So I obviously already have eyes on that. So I'm very skeptical about the whole thing, because you can't know anything about Operation Gladio and not think it's a big fucking deal. You just can't. Sorry. Sunshine, go ahead.
Yeah, I think Millie Weaver was the cohort with that you were speaking about, asked me with Tori. And then with that Alex Jones, I mean, just look what he did with Sandy Hook, and I think we can all follow that 80-20 rule with him as well. And now if you watch, we have Candace Owens and that Ian Carroll, they're doing the same type of thing.
So the very first time I came across Tori early on, like around 2019, during the whole Q discovery, it was that Bergie guy, Millie Weaver, and Tori Says, all three of them together. It took me 5 seconds of listening to the three of them together to know 100% that the entire thing was bullshit. So yeah, I don't know where the other two are now. I don't know what they're doing. But anyway, Miles,
They're
go ahead.
still
And
around.
then,
That Millie's still around.
okay, Miles, and then all along.
Yeah, they're still around. We've been trying to vet these people for years when we're listening to them. It's very difficult because it's always secondhand information. I don't want to get involved with these people, but Tori Says, we vetted her a long time ago, and to me, she's just a Greek gypsy, and we know gypsies are really good at pickpocketing people. That's all she does, is just steal from other people. So we vetted Bergie and her and Millie, but the weird thing about Alex, when we vetted him a long time ago, he's got so much dirt and skeletons in his closet. with drug abuse and who he's hanging out with in Hollywood with. Now, he never gets arrested. Now, sure, you can sue the guy, but all the people that work around him, they go to jail. Alex never goes to jail. What does that tell you?
Yeah. So all along, go ahead.
Yeah, Colonel, what you were saying earlier about some of the people who are given the mic in order to discredit their followers to some extent reminded me very much of the strategy that I have somewhat belaboredly probably called left gatekeeping. In particular, the best example would be Noam Chomsky, this all too celebrated, quote, leftist, unquote, who, would be check all the boxes in terms of being against, like, sort of distant imperialist, distant CIA activities, whether it be El Salvador, which was topical in the 1980s, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, what was the one thing that I later turned out, but only because I kept on reading Cold War history and just experienced the cognitive dissonance between what this, like, leftist was saying versus what the historians were saying, lied like a MF, as it were, regarding the JFK assassination and above all the foreign policy. And again, it's like you get your allegiance through little things that will only impact like college educated folks, but the stuff that would impact the masses and whether or not the message can spread to the quote unquote the masses who, some people call the great unwashed, and the left is supposed to like wash them, but they keep them unwashed because they're a fake leftist. The big issues that could affect every high school from New York to California is the elections and the big media cover-up of this CIA coup of late 1963. It seems to be a kind of similar thing going on the opposite big spectrum, as it were.
Yeah. So I just wanted to address a couple of things over on the Rumble chat. So Renee asked, what's up with Alpha speaking to Kyle? Renee, we all have relationships with people and we're all adults. So I'm not going to speak on Alpha's behalf. You can go ask Alpha what his relationship is with Kyle. Alpha and I have a great working relationship. That's not going to change. And that's all I'm going to say on that. Also, Maker Sarge is a reminder that we had to reschedule the War Hamster secret societies for this week to tomorrow at 10 a.m. So hopefully everybody can join us then as part of that. Should be interesting. Anyway, that's all I have. I think we've got all of the hands attended to. So thank you guys for being here. I hope you have a great weekend. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. is our only show that I have scheduled so far. If anything changes, I will let you know. Again, I appreciate you guys very, very, very much. And Fergie 62, thank you again for your donation. I appreciate it. That's going directly to Bridget for our bookcase, our bookshelf.
I finally got cardboard to package it. Oh my God. It's like if it's not one thing, it's another.
Cool.
So it'll be shipping out very shortly.
Cool. I'm so excited. So hopefully within the next couple of weeks, we'll have that installed and we'll take pictures and I'll do you guys another little tour around the studio here. And you guys can see where our new bookcase is going in. So thanks again. Sunshine, go ahead.
Just wanted to let you know, watch for the pond this week. He's been saying he's with everything going on, he would like to address some things. So he might be opening this week. Has he said anything to you, Stellar? I know he did in our group chat. Guess she's gone. Anyhow, just watch for the pond to be open sometime this week.
Yeah, absolutely. Very excited about that. All right. Thanks, everybody. Take care. Have a nice weekend. Okay. Thank you guys for being here. I appreciate it. And we will see you tomorrow on Secret Societies. Take care.